Could you just describe what that is, where that comes from, what that name means? It goes by other names as well. I think Triffin's paradox, etc. What is Triffin's trilemma?
Sure. It's so in February of 1960, this Belgian economist comes in front of Congress, and he lays out what he sees as the fatal flaw in the Bretton Woods system, and he essentially says, "Look, we're a global reserve currency that's based on gold." And the problem is as the rest of the world starts to experience economic growth that's in real terms greater than ours, their demand for dollars will start to grow. And since the dollar is the world reserve currency, we have to supply these dollars to these other countries. And the problem is, do we do this? Because either way, there's going to be a crisis. If we do not solve, their dollar funding needs and we do not export enough dollars for them to use, there's going to be a global liquidity crisis in what he called the global depression. So essentially, these countries wouldn't have enough dollars on hand to settle their trade, to settle their dollar debts, right? To hold as foreign currency reserves for their central banks. They wouldn't have those reserves available to them, and that would cause a global contraction economically. And then he's like, the other side of the dilemma is that we do provide these dollar reserves, but that means we have to continually become net exporters of dollars, which means net importers of goods. So we have to export our manufacturing base, but it also means that we will have to basically expand our debt base exponentially because we'll have to allow these other countries to be able to invest in our debt securities and recycle their dollar surpluses somehow, right? And so basically what that means is that the U.S. would become covered in debt and buried in debt until it eventually defaulted and a new reserve currency was chosen. And so Triffin's dilemma was found to be, the nail in the coffin of every global reserve currency. It becomes so big that the rest of the world needs it so much that it has to just continually export and export and export units of currency to the point where the world is flooded with this currency. It gets flooded with debt. It defaults. The currency loses value, and a new reserve currency is picked. And so this dilemma has basically made it so every global reserve currency has lasted for an average of 75 years.
Yeah.
You can't sustain this impossible dilemma forever.
Right.
You can't export currency forever and not have it have an impact on the total value of your money.
So this again is a product of that defiance of economic reality through central planning, basically, right? And this is what we've seen in the U.S., actually, right? We've seen U.S. indebtedness go way up. We've seen a hollowing out of the American industrial base, right? We've got offshored a lot of our productive capacity, and we've become much more of a financialized economy. Does this pertain to the dollar milkshake theory, too, where this whole idea of exporting all these dollars and then creating the euro dollar system and all of that? Is that related to Triffin's trilemma?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so the reason why we didn't lose reserve currency status, when Triffin's dilemma finally came home to roost, and Triffin was correct. So in 1960, he proclaimed that this would eventually end the dollar and Bretton Woods system as we know it. And 11 years later, in August of 1971, as we all know, he was correct. We went off the gold standard. And at the time, everyone thought that, we were going to find a new global reserve currency. Maybe we were going to be using gold. Gold prices skyrocketed for the rest of the decade. Inflation rips in the U.S. And there's this kind of in-between period where people weren't exactly sure what was going to come next. And the genius of, the central planners is that, Kissinger flies to Saudi Arabia in 1974 and creates the petrodollar system. And then at the same time, there's the emergence of the Eurodollar system, which creates global systemic demand for dollars because all these banks are now trading dollars with each other and loaning dollars to each other. And the U.S., of course, enforces and protects the system and fosters it. And so they're eventually able to kind of, skip the default part of Triffin's dilemma and roll it over into a new system. So they said, okay, well, we defaulted on the gold, but now the new reserve asset is U.S. Treasuries. And so since we're not defaulting U.S. Treasuries, this is the new global reserve system is the U.S. dollar, and the asset that underlies it is the U.S. Treasury. And so they were able to kick the can, quote unquote, down the road pretty far because they switched all the demand from gold-based dollars into debt-based dollars.
So again, you need bag holders to make the currency system work.
Exactly.
And so when we laminated from gold or depegged from gold, we had to repeg to something that gave the dollar reservation demand that just happened to be black gold, oil. But then we also got this other component of reservation demand from the Eurodollar system.
Yes.
Now, is the Eurodollar system just a manifestation of the global market trying to, I guess it's demand for one money in a way, because like it just simplifies things. Obviously, if we do global commerce in one currency, is that why the Eurodollar system emerges? That people just, it's more economically efficient to conduct commerce in one currency rather than multiple currencies.
Yeah, that's part of it. The origins of the Eurodollar system are pretty mysterious. I've done a couple of pieces on it, but the first like major documented emergence of it is in 1955 at a bank called the Midland Bank in the UK. So we're talking, this is post World War II. The Marshall Plan dollars have all flowed into Europe to rebuild, and they're still using them to rebuild their economies. And the Midland Bank decided to start using U.S. dollars to fund transactions in the Forex markets. And at the time, there was a lot of strict regulations against using any other currency other than British pound for the British banks. But luckily for Midland, is the regulators in the UK just batted a blind eye, right? Because they understood at the time that their currency was falling in favor globally. That the full switch from British pounds as a reserve currency to US dollars still took 15 years, but by this time it's 55. It's been 10 years since the end of World War II. The amount of US dollar reserves is rising globally, and the amount of British pound reserves is falling very quickly. And so they turned a blind eye and let this bank take dollar reserves and loan them out in the markets and generate a yield. And as soon as the Midland started doing this, a dozen other banks within 2 years in the UK started doing it, and then it spread across Europe, it spread to Asia, it spread to Africa. All these banks started doing the same deal where they would take US dollars, loan them out for interest,